to tell you a tale about two worlds. The world we believe we live in and the world we actually live in. The world we believe we live in comes to us from the media. The media loves viewers, or I should be more specific, the media loves the advertising dollars that the viewers bring us. And the viewers, in turn, what do they love? The viewers love bad news. We love stories of murder and wars and pestilence and plagues. Now, if you ask people, is that the kind of news you like? People will say no. In fact, that's why the world is becoming so horrible. We're all divisive. It's because we get all of this bad news. We'll say that. And yet, if you look at our behavior, what do you see? You see, for example, CNN.com, the 24th most popular website in the United States, where 24/7 you can find all the bad news that's going on in the world. If you prefer to hear about good news, there are places you can find that. For example, goodnewsnetwork.org, the 20,158th most popular website in the United States. And there you'll find all sorts of news about good things that are going on. There's a website, ismycomputeron.com. And if you go to ismycomputeron.com, you see this. Ismycomputeron.com is the 58,000th most popular website in the United States. In terms of our revealed preference, we have demonstrated that we like Good News Network about as much as we like Is My Computer On. Where do we spend our time? We spend our time here at CNN. And we believe what CNN tells us, and rightly so. Mainstream media doesn't lie. This is not a story about fake news. I mean, they'll get things wrong from time to time, but generally speaking, the mainstream media tells us the truth, and we rightly so believe what they say. The problem is, we go one step further, and we don't believe what they don't say. And this has led us to have this misconstrued vision of the world we live in. For example, we all know that we live in a nation awash in gun violence. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because CNN tells us so. What happens? Every year that gun violence gets worse, CNN will say gun violence has gotten worse. And it gets worse the next year, and they'll say gun violence has gotten worse. And then there'll be years that go by where gun violence doesn't get worse, but what does CNN do? They talk about other things that are going wrong. Plagues and pestilence and war, whatnot, until gun violence gets worse again, and they'll say gun violence gets worse. And so, over time, what do we hear from the media? We hear this nonstop litany of gun violence getting worse. We believe what they say, rightly so. But we don't believe what they don't say. And what they don't say is they don't talk about the years in which gun violence got better. Pew Research Center has surveyed Americans since 1992, asking them, do you think gun violence in the country is worse or better than it was last year? And since 1992, in every year save two, Americans have said, oh yes, gun violence in this country is worse. But if you look at the actual data, gun violence actually only got worse in 1/3 of the years. 2/3 of the years it got better. Now, you might say in response to that, yeah, but I know what's going on here. The bad years were really bad. And because of that, you have a couple of years where gun violence gets really way worse, and a lot of years where it gets better, but only gets a little bit better, so that the overall trend is gun violence getting worse. And yet we can go and we can look at the data, and what do we see? The homicide rate per capita in the United States, not the homicide, but the firearm homicide rate per capita in the United States. It dropped precipitously in the 1990s, and it's held pretty constant since then. We had a bit of a blip during COVID. But generally speaking, this is not a story of gun violence getting worse. It's a story at the worst of gun violence remaining the same after a precipitous drop in the 1990s. Now, you might say in response to that, yes, but guns are used in all sorts of crimes where people aren't killed. Yeah, we have data on that too. It's called the non-fatal firearm crime rate. And what you see is that's been dropping even at twice the rate that the firearm homicide rate has been dropping. We have come to believe that we are a nation awash in violence because we believe what the media tells us. They tell us when gun violence gets worse, but we don't believe what they don't tell us, and they don't tell us when it gets better. Perhaps the grandfather of all firearm homicides is mass shootings. And if we look at mass shooting data, we see this, and this is the sort of thing the media will tell us, and this is absolutely correct. You can look at this data over time, and you see, year after year, plus or minus some noise, the number of Americans killed in mass shootings in this country has been rising significantly. That's true. But what the media doesn't tell us is the context here. Now, what I'm about to show you are a number of Americans killed by knives in the United States over these same years. I'm going to superimpose it on top of this graph. The number of Americans killed by knives in the United States is about 15 times the number of Americans killed in mass shootings. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be concerned about mass shootings. I am suggesting that if we are not 15 times as concerned about the number of Americans killed in knifings, that we've got our priorities mixed up. And those mixed up priorities come out in the form of mixed up policy. And the mixed up policy takes our limited resources, it ends up applying them not to the greater problem, but to the noisier problem, the problem we perceive exists. We saw this with COVID. We heard all sorts of reports night after night about the number of Americans that are killed by COVID. And in fact, if you annualize the data for 2020, so this was the height of COVID, on average, at an annual rate, 375,000 Americans dying of COVID each year. This is true, and this is what the media tells us. What the media doesn't tell us is the context. And the context here is the number of Americans killed by other things. Principal among them, heart disease and cancer. On an annual basis, more than twice the number of Americans die of heart disease and cancer as die of COVID. Now, you might say in response to that, well, yeah, but COVID is an infectious disease. You really can't make this comparison. You're absolutely right. We can't make this comparison. COVID is an infectious disease. But that argument actually cuts in the other direction. If we had done nothing about COVID, no lockdowns, no social distancing, no investment in vaccines, if we had done nothing, the number of people who died of COVID would have been much higher than what you see here. But because COVID is infectious, over time, the number of deaths would tail out as we develop natural immunity. But there is no natural immunity to heart disease and cancer because they aren't infectious. And so if we do nothing about heart disease and cancer, year after year, those numbers don't tail off, they stay exactly where they are. And again, I'm not saying we should have done nothing about COVID. I am saying that if we didn't spend at least twice the resources on heart disease and cancer that we spent on COVID, then we're misallocating our resources, that we're attacking the thing that's noisy rather than the thing that's actually serious. And you can see some of this in the news. If you go back and look up headlines on Google from March to May of 2020, you'll see the headlines are all about COVID deaths. This is what the media was talking about until about May of 2020. In May of 2020, the number of deaths from COVID start to tail off. They start to decline. Now, the media wants eyeballs. It wants viewers. To get viewers, it's got to show you what you want, and you've demonstrated that what you want is bad news. This is no longer bad news. So starting in about June of 2020, the narrative changes, and the media stops talking about COVID deaths, and they start talking about COVID infections, because that number was still going up. And we could talk about that because that's scary. But then round about September 2020, this number started tailing off. It was no longer scary. And so the media changed the narrative again, and you'll see the headlines about COVID cases. And this is the gift that keeps on giving. Because in COVID cases, we count everybody. People who had COVID, people who died of COVID, people who recovered from COVID. That number can only go up by definition. And so the media talks about that, and talks about it for a long time, up until March of 2021, when people start to become inured to this, and it's not as scary anymore. Their attentions wander elsewhere. What can the media do to get your attentions back? We've got to show you something scary. Let's talk about deaths with COVID. Yeah, here's the thing. We quickly found out that deaths with COVID, yes, they include people who die of COVID. It also includes people who die in car accidents who happen to have COVID at the time. And so you see the media shifting the narrative, again, not to say that they're lying to you, but they're looking to attract your attention by showing you things that you want to see, which are things that are scary. We talk every election cycle about why wages are stagnating, and this is the thing that the politicians will say and the media will report it. And if you look at the data on this, you find this is inflation-adjusted wages going back to whatever that is, 1979, and they're up 8% from 1979, or if you want to look at from the 1980s, they're up about 18%. And so you can point to those numbers, you can say, well, actually, wages aren't stagnating on the one hand. On the other hand, we're talking about what here, 45 years, and we've only gained 8 to 18% in purchasing power? That's not much to write home about. This is what the media will show us, and it's absolutely correct. But it's only half the story. The other half of the story is we aren't paid wages, we're paid compensation. And compensation has been going up 60% since 1979. But this story isn't scary, and so it's not the story that you hear. Along with this, we'll talk about the declining middle class, and I'm going to show you some numbers on the middle class here. I'll divide incomes into the poor, the middle class, and the rich, and I'm going to show you a bunch of bars. The height of the bar shows you the fraction of U.S. households in that income category. So here's how we read this. This is 1970. In 1970, 16% of us were earning what today we would call $35,000 to $50,000. Also in 1970, 24% of us were earning what today we would call $50,000 to $75,000, and 14% of us were earning what today we would call $75,000 to $100,000. That's the middle class. 53% of us were middle class in 1970. That same year, 33% of us were in the poor classes, 14% of us were in the rich classes. Now, what I'm going to do is roll time forward and watch what happens to those bars as time progresses. And here we are in 2020, and what has happened? Look at the middle class. In 1970, 53% of us were middle class. Adjusted for inflation, only 40% of us are middle class today. This is the truth the media repeats, and it's absolutely correct. The middle class is disappearing. But what the media doesn't tell you, and is very happy for you to assume, is, well, if the middle class is disappearing, we must be becoming poor. But look at the poor classes. They've fallen as well. 33% of us were poor in 1970. Today is only 26%. Where did all these American households go? They went into the rich classes. In 1970, 14% of us were rich. Adjusted for inflation even, today 34% of us are rich, more than 1/3. But that story doesn't attract eyeballs. That's good news. You don't want to hear good news, and so you don't hear that. You hear the middle story, what's happening to the middle class. We talk about people paying their fair share of taxes, and we can ask what is fair, and are the poor paying in too much, or the rich not paying enough, and we can go through the numbers. I ask students this year after year, and generally speaking, these are the numbers that they say. The rich should pay about 30%, the poor should pay around 5%, the middle class around 15%. And if you actually look at the numbers, what do you find? You find that people are actually paying not just that, but when you account for transfers, money the government gives back to people. And that's part of what we do in helping the poor. When you account for that, actually, our taxes aren't fair, but they aren't fair in the opposite direction that the media reports. It's the poor who are receiving a tremendous amount of money back from the government. This is true, but it's not a story you'll hear the media tell, not because the media is going to lie to you, but because this is good news and we don't want to hear it. Perhaps the most pernicious thing that the media will say is it will point to problems that occur in capitalist systems and say, look, there are evils in capitalist systems, and this is what happens when you let markets run amok. And they'll give us lots of examples that are also correct. Capitalism is by no means a perfect system. You can find all sorts of problems with it. However, what they won't tell you is what you see if you divide the world into the more economically free and the less economically free. And if you divide the world into the more economically free and the less economically free, what you find is when you look at per capita income, the less economically free countries are there, the more economically free countries are there. When you look at poor countries only and say, forget about comparing poor and rich. Let's look at the poor only. Let's divide them into two groups. The poor countries that are more economically free, the poor countries that are less economically free. You see the same phenomenon. Lower numbers, these are poor countries, but the same phenomenon. It's on average in the more capitalist systems, the more free market systems where the incomes are higher. You see it also with income inequality, and of course this is the thing that the media will tell you that is absolutely correct. In capitalist systems, you get income inequality. That is true. What they won't tell you is the other half of the story, that in non-capitalist countries, the economic inequality is worse. What you find if you look at poverty rates, even amongst the poorest countries, are lower in the more economically free, the more capitalist countries. They're higher in the less economically free. If you look at child labor rates are lower in the more economically free countries. If you look at the poorest countries, there's less child labor in the more economically free countries. If you look at quality of life, and this thing is beautiful, I'm going to cross-reference economic freedom with the UN's measure of quality of life. The UN, not an organization ever accused of being right-wing or free market. And if you cross-reference that economic freedom with what the UN says is quality of life, you find the same phenomenon. There are exceptions, and the media will tell you the exceptions because it'll get you mad, it'll get you coming back and watching more. What they won't tell you is the trend. And the trend is, on average, it's the countries that are more economically free that will give you better quality of life. You find the same thing with the environment. You find the same thing whether you look at air pollution or you look at deforestation. All of these ways we might think about countries being healthy, successful. You find these things, not in every case, but on average, associated with more economic freedom. So this leaves us with this question, all right, so what? The media is looking to attract dollars. They're a profit-oriented entity, and like any profit-oriented entity, they want profit. And so what do? The profit comes from advertisers. They've got to get advertisers. But to get advertisers, they need viewers. But to get viewers, they've got to show us what the viewers want to see. And what do the viewers want to see? What have they demonstrated by their behaviors they want to see? They want to see bad news. The sad thing is that this leaves us with this belief that the world is horrid, when in fact it's wondrous. The dangerous thing is that it leaves us with the belief that free markets are the problem, when in fact they're the solution. To hear more stories about economics and government, subscribe to my wonderful podcast, Words and Numbers, and get a copy of my excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. Christmas is coming up. Buy one for all your friends and family, where you will hear plenty more stories like this. Thank you.